I woke up early that morning to load the car. The plan was simple: a weekend camping trip on a friend's farm out in the countryside. It wasn't a typical camping spot, but that's what made it appealing. The farm, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, was large and isolated, surrounded by fields and dense patches of woods. I needed a break from city life, and the idea of pitching a tent on a quiet, private farm seemed perfect. The drive took about 3 hours. I passed small towns, old barns, and fields dotted with cows. The landscape grew greener and quieter as I got closer. When I finally arrived at the farm, the sun was high, casting long shadows from the tall trees that lined the property. The farmhouse sat at the top of a gentle hill, a weathered but sturdy structure with peeling white paint and a tin roof that gleamed in the sunlight. My friend, Mark, wasn't home. He'd given me permission to camp while he and his family were out of town. I parked near the house, grabbed my gear, and walked to the back of the property where the fields gave way to woods. I wanted to set up my tent near a small pond Mark had mentioned. It was supposed to be picturesque, surrounded by trees, with clear water reflecting the sky. After about a 15-minute walk, I found it. The pond was as serene as Mark described, with dragonflies skimming the surface and the occasional ripple from a fish. The woods formed a natural barrier on one side, and the open fields stretched out on the other. It felt perfect, quiet, private, and far from anyone. I set up my tent under a large oak tree near the edge of the pond. The ground was soft, covered in a mix of grass and fallen leaves. I unrolled my sleeping bag, arranged my gear, and started gathering wood for a fire. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was beginning to set. The orange and pink hues of the sky reflected on the pond, creating a stunning view. I lit the fire and sat back to enjoy the peace. As the evening wore on, I began to notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from civilization. No cars, no distant hum of the city, just the occasional chirp of a cricket or rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt unnerving but also freeing. Around 9 p.m., the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was warm, and the tent felt stuffy, so I left the small mesh window open to let in some air. I could see the moonlight filtering through the branches, casting faint patterns on the tent walls. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it. A low, distant sound. It wasn't an animal noise, at least not one I recognized. It was more like a faint hum or drone, barely audible, but it made me sit up. I listened for a while, straining to figure out where it was coming from, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I chalked it up to the wind or some distant machinery on another farm and lay back down. A few hours later, I woke up again, this time to a much closer noise. It was a faint crunching, like someone or something was walking through the leaves outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I lay completely still, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal. I reached for the flashlight beside me and slowly turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the tent walls. The sound stopped. I stayed frozen, listening. After a few minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent slightly and shine the flashlight outside. The fire had died completely, and the woods were pitch black. I couldn't see anything unusual. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of the pond. They weren't from a deer or any other animal. They were human and barefoot. The prints were large, much larger than my own feet, and the toes dug deep into the ground as if whoever made them had been walking slowly, carefully. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been out here, close to my camp, in the middle of the night. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor had wandered onto the property, though Mark had told me the nearest farm was miles away. I decided to brush it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I explored the woods a bit, staying within sight of the pond, but I didn't find anything unusual. No signs of anyone else. By the time the sun began to set, I was on edge. I built the fire bigger this time, hoping it would make me feel safer. That night, the noises started earlier. The same faint crunching of leaves, followed by an occasional snapping twig. This time, it didn't stop when I turned on the flashlight. It seemed to circle the camp, moving in and out of the woods. I stayed in the tent, clutching a small knife I'd brought with me. My heart was racing, and I was sweating despite the cool night air. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass in front of the tent, but it was so quick and faint that I couldn't be sure. I didn't sleep much that night. When the first light of dawn broke, I stepped outside to find more footprints. This time, they were closer to the tent, circling it. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something in the dirt a few feet away. It was a small pile of rocks carefully stacked. It hadn't been there the day before. Someone had been close enough to my camp to build it while I was sleeping. I hiked back to my car as fast as I could, constantly feeling like I was being watched. When I finally reached the farmhouse, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the back window of my car, written in the dust, was a single word: stay. I didn't. It was the summer of 2018 when my brother Jake and I decided to go camping in the backwoods of South Carolina. Jake was 29, 2 years older than me, and had always been the more adventurous one. He'd been trying to get me out camping for years, but I'd always found an excuse to avoid it. Bugs, heat, and the thought of no cell service just didn't appeal to me. But that year, I finally caved. Life had been stressful, and I thought maybe being out in nature would help me clear my head. We settled on a remote spot near the Francis Marion National Forest, about an hour north of Charleston. Jake had been there before and promised it was perfect. Secluded but not too far off the beaten path, with plenty of trails to explore. He even mentioned a small, tucked-away fishing pond he'd discovered on his last trip. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive out was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and bumpier the closer we got to our destination. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Jake was grinning ear to ear as we pulled up to the clearing where we'd set up camp. The spot was picturesque. A wide clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, with a small creek trickling nearby. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the site. It was peaceful, I had to admit, even for someone like me who wasn't big on the outdoors. We spent the first couple of hours setting up our tents and getting the fire pit ready. Jake, being the seasoned camper, handled most of it while I fumbled my way through pitching my tent. By the time we finished, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, and the air was cooling off. After dinner, we sat around the fire, drinking beers and listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving through the underbrush. It was the kind of quiet you don't get in the city, and for the first time in a long time, I felt relaxed. As the fire died down, we decided to call it a night. Jake was out cold within minutes, but I had trouble falling asleep. The forest seemed alive with sounds: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the normal activity of the woods, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, we woke early and decided to hike to the fishing pond Jake had mentioned. It was about 3 miles from our campsite, according to him, and the trail was mostly flat. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but Jake was excited, and I figured it'd be a good way to spend the day. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but Jake navigated it with ease. I followed close behind, swatting at mosquitoes and trying not to trip over roots. After about an hour, we reached the pond. It was small, more like a large pool with dark, still water surrounded by reeds. Jake set up his fishing gear while I wandered along the edge of the pond, taking in the scenery. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. There were no birds, no frogs, no insects, just the occasional ripple on the surface of the water. Jake didn't seem to notice. He was focused on his fishing, casting his line and reeling it in with practiced precision. I sat on a fallen log, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. After an hour or so, Jake caught a small bass. He held it up triumphantly before releasing it back into the water. We decided to head back to camp shortly after. The trail seemed different on the way back. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to camp, we found our site had been disturbed. Our tents were still standing, but the contents of Jake's backpack were scattered across the ground. His flashlight, water bottle, and some snacks were strewn about. "Probably raccoons," Jake said, brushing it off, but I wasn't so sure. There were no claw marks, no torn fabric. It was as if someone or something had gone through our stuff deliberately. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified: the crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving just outside the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural sound, a growl, cut through the stillness. I shook Jake awake, but by the time he was alert, the sound was gone. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just a coyote or a deer, but I knew what I'd heard. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave. As we were loading the car, I noticed something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, but larger than any I'd ever seen, and barefoot. The toes were long, almost claw-like. Jake tried to make light of it, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We drove back to civilization in silence, neither of us wanting to admit how shaken we were. To this day, I don't know what was out there in those woods. I've told myself it was just an animal, or maybe a prank by some local kids. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever it was watching us. It knew we were there, and it wanted us gone. It was a rainy October night in 2017 when I found myself stationed near the southern U.S. border for an unusual border duty assignment. My job wasn't glamorous or particularly heroic. It mostly involved monitoring a stretch of remote desert land for any signs of illegal activity. We weren't law enforcement, just a private security team hired by a company that had some property in the area. The location was somewhere in Texas, about 20 miles from the nearest town, a small, rundown place called Pierce Creek. I was 31 at the time, a bit restless in life, and willing to take any job that paid decently. The camp was basic: a canvas tent big enough for 2 people, a portable stove, a couple of cots, and a cooler with water and snacks. I was alone that night, covering for another guy who had called out. The area was pitch black except for the weak glow of my flashlight and the faint, distant lights of a nearby highway. Rain was coming down hard, turning the dusty trails into mud and making everything cold and damp. I had parked the company truck about 50 yards away from the tent, near a small ridge where the terrain sloped downward. From there, I had a decent view of the surrounding area, though the rain and darkness made visibility terrible. I could barely see past a few hundred feet, but I wasn't too worried. This job was usually uneventful, boring, even. Most nights, nothing happened. Just hours of listening to the wind and waiting for my shift to end. By 10 p.m., the rain had turned into a relentless downpour. I sat in the tent, flipping through an old paperback novel I'd brought to pass the time. The sound of rain hitting the canvas was soothing at first, but it gradually grew louder, almost deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense of being cut off from the world. No one knew exactly where I was except for my supervisor, and even he wasn't reachable until morning. Around 11 p.m., I decided to step outside to stretch my legs. The rain had eased up slightly, but the ground was a mess of slippery mud. I shined my flashlight around the area, the beam cutting through the darkness. The ridge near the truck looked more eroded than before, likely from the rain. Everything else seemed normal, just wet and miserable. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something that made me pause. In the distance, maybe 300 yards away, I saw what looked like a faint light. It wasn't moving, just hovering low to the ground. At first, I thought it might be a reflection or maybe even a distant vehicle, but it didn't make sense. This stretch of land wasn't near any main roads, and the terrain was too rough for most cars. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the rain and darkness made it impossible to make out any details. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the light, trying to figure out what it was. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it went out. The darkness returned, and the only sound was the steady patter of rain. I told myself it was probably nothing, a reflection, a trick of the light, or maybe someone camping further out. But the uneasiness lingered. I went back inside the tent and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to that strange light. What if it wasn't harmless? What if someone was out there watching me? I shook off the thought and tried to be rational. This wasn't a horror movie. It was probably just my imagination getting the better of me. By midnight, the rain had picked up again, and the wind was howling. The tent flapped violently, and I started to regret taking this job. I decided to do another patrol around the camp, partly to reassure myself and partly because sitting still was making me anxious. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The ground was worse than before, a soupy mess of mud that sucked at my boots. I walked a slow circle around the tent, shining my light in every direction. Nothing seemed out of place. The truck was still parked where I'd left it, and the ridge beyond looked the same, though I noticed a few small rocks had tumbled down from the slope. I scanned the horizon again, half expecting to see that light, but the darkness was impenetrable. I was about to head back inside when I heard it, a faint sound, almost drowned out by the rain. It was coming from the direction of the ridge, a low, scraping noise that didn't belong. I froze, my flashlight pointed toward the slope. The noise stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing and the relentless rain. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to return. When it didn't, I convinced myself it was just debris shifting in the mud. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way back to the tent, double-checking the zipper to make sure it was secure. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was nothing out there, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. At 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My first thought was the ridge. It must have collapsed further. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled outside, my heart pounding. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wind was freezing. I shined the light toward the ridge, expecting to see a pile of mud and rocks, but what I saw instead made my stomach drop. The truck was gone. I ran to where I'd parked it, slipping and sliding in the mud. The ground near the edge of the ridge was heavily disturbed, deep tire tracks leading to a jagged drop-off. The truck must have slid down during the rainstorm. I peered over the edge, shining my flashlight into the darkness below. I could just barely make out the shape of the truck, tilted on its side about 20 feet down. The rain had turned the slope into a muddy slide, and there was no way I could climb down safely. I felt a wave of panic. The truck had all the communication equipment, the extra food, and the emergency supplies. Without it, I was stranded until morning. I tried to think rationally. The truck was a loss, but I was safe, at least for now. I just needed to wait until daylight, when the rain would hopefully stop and I could figure out a way to call for help. I made my way back to the tent, drenched and shivering. As I unzipped the entrance, I stopped. There was something on the ground, a set of footprints. They weren't mine. They led from the ridge directly to my tent. I still don't know why I agreed to that camping trip. My business partner, Mike, had been pushing for it for weeks, saying we needed a break from work. He wanted to unwind, as he put it, and insisted that getting away from the noise of the city would do us both good. Mike and I had been running a small construction company together for about 3 years. He was the kind of guy who worked hard but had a bit of a short fuse. I figured maybe this trip would help ease some of the tension he'd been carrying around. We picked a spot deep in the woods near a place called Blackwater Ridge. It wasn't a popular camping site, which Mike liked. He said he wanted solitude, away from all distractions. I wasn't as outdoorsy as he was, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. Besides, Mike had a way of convincing people to do things his way. It was late October 2017 when we finally headed out. I remember the leaves were bright orange and red, covering the forest floor like a thick carpet. The air was cool but not freezing, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs as we unloaded our gear from Mike's truck. Mike had brought way too much stuff, several knives, a hatchet, rope, tarps, and even a couple of hunting rifles. I joked that he was preparing for a survivalist TV show, but he just shrugged and said, "Better safe than sorry." We hiked about 4 miles into the forest before we found a spot to set up camp. It was a clearing surrounded by tall trees, with just enough space for the tent and a fire pit. The nearest trail was about half a mile away, and we hadn't seen another person since we parked. We spent the first evening setting up camp and collecting firewood. Mike seemed unusually quiet, which wasn't like him. He was always the loudest guy in the room, cracking jokes or barking orders. But that night, he just stared into the fire, his jaw clenched like he was thinking too hard about something. When I asked him if he was okay, he just nodded and went back to sharpening his knife. I didn't push it. The next day, things started to feel off. We woke up early to explore the area, and Mike insisted on leaving a trail of markers so we wouldn't get lost. He tied bits of bright orange cloth to tree branches as we walked, which seemed like overkill to me. The forest was dense, but it wasn't that hard to navigate. Mike was acting weird, though. He kept stopping to listen, his head cocked to the side like he was hearing something I couldn't. When I asked him what was up, he'd just shake his head and keep walking. At one point, we came across a deer carcass. It looked fresh, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The body was torn open, and there were claw marks on its sides. Mike crouched down to examine it, muttering to himself. "Must have been a bear," I said, trying to break the tension. Mike just gave me this look, cold, almost annoyed, and stood up. "Let's keep moving," he said. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I was exhausted, but Mike seemed more wired than ever. He insisted on setting up extra defenses around the camp. Tripwires, makeshift alarms, and even a small perimeter of sharpened sticks he called a warning zone. "Isn't this a bit much?" I asked, but he ignored me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire crackled softly, and the wind rustled the trees above, but something felt wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves crunching nearby. Mike was awake too. He sat by the fire, clutching one of his rifles, his eyes scanning the darkness like he was expecting something or someone. The next morning, I woke up to find Mike pacing around the campsite. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept at all. "I think we should head back," I said. "This is starting to feel like a bad idea." Mike didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the deer carcass we'd passed the day before and started carving off chunks of meat with his knife. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked. "Bait," he said flatly, "for whatever's out here." That's when I started to worry. Mike wasn't acting like himself. His paranoia was ramping up, and I didn't know how to handle it. I tried to suggest packing up and leaving, but he wouldn't listen. That night was the worst. Mike insisted on keeping watch, and I didn't argue. But around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something heavy crashing through the woods. Mike was gone. I scrambled out of the tent and grabbed a flashlight, calling his name. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Then I saw him. Mike was standing about 20 feet away, holding his rifle, staring at something in the darkness. "Mike!" I hissed. "What are you doing?" He turned to me, his face pale and his eyes wild. "It's out there," he whispered. Before I could respond, he fired the rifle. The sound echoed through the forest, deafening in the stillness. I ran to him, grabbing his arm. "What are you shooting at?" He pointed into the trees, his hands shaking. "Something's watching us," he said. "It's been watching us since we got here." I didn't see anything, but Mike wouldn't calm down. He kept muttering about shadows and movement, his finger twitching on the trigger. By dawn, I'd had enough. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "I don't care what you think you saw. We need to get out of here." Mike didn't argue. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and hollow. We packed up quickly and started hiking back to the truck. But the forest didn't feel the same. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. Every sound made me jump, and I could feel Mike's tension like a weight on my chest. About halfway back, we found one of the orange markers Mike had tied to a tree. It was torn in half, hanging limply from the branch. Mike froze. "It's following us," he whispered. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "You're scaring me." The last mile was a blur. We moved as fast as we could, barely speaking. When we finally reached the truck, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the deep scratches on the driver's side door. Mike didn't say a word. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and floored it. We didn't stop until we were back in the city. It's been months since that trip, and Mike and I haven't spoken much. He quit the business shortly after, saying he needed to focus on other things. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the fear and paranoia were just in my head. But then I think about the scratches on the truck, the torn markers, and the way Mike looked that night. Something was out there, something that changed him, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. I was 28 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the fall of 2019. The idea came to me after a particularly stressful month at work. I'd spent weeks buried in emails, endless meetings, and late nights staring at spreadsheets. I needed a break from the noise and chaos, something that would help me reset. I'd always loved the outdoors, and I figured a weekend camping in the woods would be the perfect way to clear my head. The plan was simple: drive out to the national forest about 2 hours from my place, hike a couple of miles into the woods, and set up camp near one of the lesser-used trails. I wanted solitude, no crowded campgrounds or loud groups, just me, my gear, and the quiet of the forest. The weather was perfect when I left, cool, crisp air with a faint smell of autumn leaves. I had everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a map, and a compass. I even brought a GPS just in case. I'd hiked and camped plenty of times before, so I felt prepared. Looking back, I realized how overconfident I was. I arrived at the forest in the late morning, parked my car in a small gravel lot, and set off down the trail. It was beautiful. The trees were just starting to turn, their leaves a mix of gold, orange, and deep red. The trail was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. About 3 miles in, I found a spot that seemed perfect for my campsite. It was a little clearing off the trail, surrounded by trees and close to a small stream. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. By the time the sun started to set, I was sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal and enjoying the peacefulness around me. It felt like everything I'd hoped for: quiet, calming, and so far from the stress of my daily life. But as the darkness settled in, the forest seemed to change. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. A branch snapping in the distance, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, the faint feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I brushed it off as my imagination, a side effect of being alone in the dark. The next morning, I decided to hike further into the woods, beyond the trail. I wanted to see more of the forest, maybe find a good view or an interesting spot to explore. I marked my campsite on the GPS and took my map and compass, feeling confident that I wouldn't get lost. The first couple of hours were amazing. The deeper I went, the more beautiful the forest became. There were no signs of people, no litter, no footprints, nothing but untouched wilderness. But as the hours passed, I realized I'd gone farther than I planned. The trees all started to look the same, and I couldn't find any landmarks that matched my map. I checked my GPS to head back, but it kept glitching, showing me in places I knew I hadn't been. My compass wasn't much help either. It seemed to spin slightly, as if unsure of where north was. I told myself to stay calm. I'd hiked off-trail before and always found my way back. By late afternoon, I was still wandering, trying to retrace my steps. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and panic was creeping in. I hadn't seen the stream or any familiar trees for hours. I tried to use the GPS again, but the screen went black. The battery had died. That's when it hit me. I was completely lost. I sat down to collect my thoughts, trying to remember everything I knew about survival. Stay put, conserve energy, and don't let fear take over. But the forest didn't make it easy. Every sound, the rustling leaves, the distant crack of a branch, felt amplified, as if the woods were alive and watching me. I decided to stop and set up a temporary camp before it got too dark. I didn't have my tent since I'd left it at the original campsite, but I found a spot under a large tree where the ground was relatively dry. I used some branches and my emergency blanket to make a crude shelter. That night was one of the longest of my life. The cold seeped into my bones, and the noises of the forest seemed to close in around me. At one point, I heard something moving nearby, slow, deliberate steps, too heavy to be a deer. I held my breath, gripping my knife tightly, but whatever it was eventually moved away. The next day, I tried to keep moving in what I thought was the right direction. I rationed my water and ate a few granola bars, knowing I needed to conserve my supplies. I followed what I thought was the stream, but it led to a swampy area that forced me to backtrack. I started to notice things that didn't make sense. Trees with strange marks on them, almost like scratches, and piles of rocks that seemed too deliberate to be natural. I tried to tell myself they were nothing, just tricks of the mind caused by stress and exhaustion. On the third day, I found something that made my stomach drop. A rusted canteen lying in the dirt, covered in moss. Nearby, there was an old, torn piece of fabric stuck to a branch. It looked like it had been there for years. It was a reminder that others had been here before me, and that they might not have made it out. I tried to shake off the thought and focus on finding my way back. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every direction felt wrong, and every step seemed to take me deeper into the forest. By the fourth day, I was running out of food and water. My legs felt like lead, and my throat was dry and raw. I kept moving, hoping to find a trail or some sign of civilization. That's when I saw it. A cabin in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but it was my only hope. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding with relief. When I got closer, I realized something was off. The cabin was in complete disrepair, with a collapsed roof and broken windows. But what scared me the most was what I found inside. A pile of old belongings. Boots, backpacks, even a wallet with faded IDs. It was as if people had been here before me and left in a hurry, or worse, never left at all. I didn't stay long. I grabbed an old metal flask that still had some water in it and left as quickly as my legs would carry me. By the fifth day, I was too weak to keep moving. I found a spot near a clearing and sat down, trying to conserve what little energy I had left. I started to accept that I might not make it out. Then, late in the afternoon, I heard it, a faint hum in the distance. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but as it grew louder, I realized it was an engine. I stumbled toward the sound, waving my arms desperately. A group of hunters found me, barely conscious and dehydrated. They said I was miles from any trail in an area few people ever ventured into. Even now, I can't explain how I got so lost or why the forest felt so wrong. All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again. The woods have a way of swallowing you whole, and not everyone makes it back. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the forests of northern Montana, a place I'd visited a few times with friends before but never on my own. It was early fall of 2019, and I had some time off work. I was 27 then, craving solitude, the kind that only deep wilderness could give. I packed my truck with everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, enough food for 3 days, and some basic survival tools like a knife, a hatchet, and a water filter. The forest I chose was part of a national park, but it was one of the less traveled areas. The trail I planned to take wasn't marked on any official maps, but I'd found it on a forum where outdoor enthusiasts shared secret spots. It was supposed to lead to a secluded clearing near a small lake, about 5 miles from the nearest road. Perfect, I thought. I arrived at the dirt parking area just before noon on a Friday. The air was crisp, with that earthy smell of fallen leaves and damp soil. My pack was heavier than I liked, but I figured the walk wouldn't be too hard. The trail was overgrown in some places but still visible. It felt like I was stepping into a forgotten world, far from the noise and chaos of daily life. The only sounds were my boots crunching on twigs and the occasional bird call. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trees opened up to reveal the clearing I'd read about. It was everything I hoped for. The lake was small but pristine, its surface reflecting the golden hues of the surrounding trees. There was a fire pit made of stones, probably left by someone who'd camped here years ago. I set up my tent near the water, careful to choose a spot that was flat and dry. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and fishing by the lake. The fish weren't biting, so I ended up eating a freeze-dried meal for dinner. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I lit a fire and sat there, enjoying the warmth and the way the flames danced in the growing darkness. By the time I crawled into my tent, it was fully dark. The forest felt alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the gentle rhythm of nature. The next morning, I woke up to a strange feeling. It wasn't anything specific, just an odd sense that something was different. The fire pit had been undisturbed, and my gear was all where I left it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I spent the day exploring the area. There was a narrow game trail that led deeper into the forest, and I followed it for about an hour before deciding to turn back. The forest felt thicker here, the trees crowding together and blocking out the sunlight. The air was cooler, almost damp, and I noticed how quiet it was compared to the clearing. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. When I got back to camp, I noticed something odd. My hatchet, which I'd left propped against a tree, was lying on the ground a few feet away. At first, I thought it might have fallen, but the ground where it had been standing wasn't sloped. Maybe I bumped it without realizing. I pushed the thought aside and focused on collecting more firewood. The day passed without any other incidents, but that uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard something in the distance. It was faint, like the crack of a branch underfoot, but it could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, or even just the wind. Still, I found myself staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to see what was out there. The forest was a wall of shadows, impenetrable and silent. When I finally went to bed, I made sure my hatchet was inside the tent with me. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why, but then I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. My heart started pounding as I strained to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving closer. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear or a deer wandering through the camp. But the steps sounded too heavy for a deer and too deliberate for a bear. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, clutching the hatchet in one hand. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural breathing just outside my tent. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, human but not quite right. It was as if someone was trying to breathe quietly but couldn't quite manage it. The breathing moved around the tent, slow and steady. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my hands slick with sweat. I didn't dare move, didn't even blink. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and I heard the footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, gripping the hatchet and staring at the tent walls, waiting for something to happen. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to stay calm. I told myself it was probably some crazy hiker messing with me, though I didn't believe it. I decided to pack up and head back to the truck. The clearing no longer felt peaceful, it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. As I took down the tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, right outside the tent, were bare footprints. They were large, larger than my own, and they led from the edge of the clearing to where I'd heard the breathing. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The hike back to the truck felt like it took forever. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me whip around, expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded my gear into the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near my truck, leading away into the woods. They weren't mine. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into the truck and drove away, not looking back. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that weekend. I've told myself it was just some weird prank, maybe a hunter or another camper trying to scare me. But deep down, I know that's not true. Someone was out there watching me, waiting, and I'll never know why. I never thought much of camping trips. They were always fun as a kid, but as I got older, the appeal wore off. But that summer in 2018, my mom convinced me to go on one. She said her friend, Linda, and Linda's teenage son, Chris, were going up to a campsite near Lake Tillman, a remote spot in northern Idaho, and it would be good for me to tag along. I was 21 at the time, and I figured it wouldn't hurt. Maybe some time outdoors would help me clear my head. Linda was nice enough, and Chris was 16, a bit awkward but polite. The plan was simple. We'd spend 3 nights at a secluded site near the lake. It wasn't an official campsite with amenities, more like a clearing deep in the woods that Linda knew about from her childhood. She said her family used to camp there all the time. We left early one Friday morning in Linda's SUV, packed with tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and all the usual camping gear. The drive took nearly 4 hours, most of it on winding, rural roads. Eventually, we turned onto a narrow dirt path that snaked its way into the forest. Linda had a printed map since there was no cell service out here. The farther we drove, the more I realized how isolated we were. No other cars, no houses, just miles of trees in every direction. Finally, we arrived at the clearing. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by tall pines with a view of the lake through the trees. The lake itself was still and quiet, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. There was no one else around, which I thought was strange for a summer weekend, but Linda said it was normal. This spot wasn't well known, and most people stuck to the official campgrounds closer to town. We spent the first day setting up camp. Linda and I pitched the tents while Chris gathered firewood. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. By evening, we had a fire going and roasted hot dogs for dinner. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt relaxed. That night, I slept in my own tent while Linda and Chris shared one. The sounds of the forest were loud, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, but comforting. I drifted off quickly, feeling safe in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. The trail around the lake was overgrown but still passable. We hiked for about an hour, enjoying the quiet. At one point, we found a small, abandoned cabin tucked away in the trees. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The windows were broken, and the roof was caved in on one side. Linda said it must have been a hunting cabin, but Chris and I were more interested in the rusted tools and old cans of food scattered around the interior. After lunch, Chris and I went down to the lake while Linda stayed at camp to read. The water was freezing, but Chris didn't seem to mind. He swam for a while, and I sat on the shore, skipping stones. The forest felt different that afternoon. It was quieter than before, almost too quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, things started to feel off. As we sat around the fire, we heard movement in the woods, branches snapping and leaves crunching. Linda said it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds were heavy, like something bigger. Chris joked about bears, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder. When I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I lay awake for hours listening. The forest sounds seemed louder, more deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent, but when I unzipped it and looked out, there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint glow of the dying fire. The next morning, we found something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, the ground was disturbed, like someone had been digging. It wasn't a large hole, just a shallow patch of dirt that had been turned over. Linda said it was probably an animal, but Chris and I exchanged uneasy glances. It looked too neat, too deliberate. That day, we decided to hike farther from camp. Linda wanted to show us a spot where her family used to fish. We walked for nearly 2 hours, following an old trail that wound through the forest. Along the way, we found more signs of disturbance: broken branches, piles of rocks that looked out of place, and once, what looked like an old campsite. There were burned logs arranged in a circle and bits of trash, rusted cans, and a torn sleeping bag. Felt wrong, like we were intruding. When we reached the fishing spot, the tension eased a bit. The view was stunning. A small, rocky cove with crystal clear water. We spent the afternoon there, but I couldn't fully relax. I kept thinking about the noises, the dug-up dirt, the old campsite. Something about this place felt wrong. That night, the sounds came back. This time, they were closer, too close. Heavy footsteps circled the camp, slow and deliberate. I could hear Chris shifting in his tent, probably awake and listening too. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt tight. Then came the breathing, low, guttural, and unmistakably human. It moved past my tent, then stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually, the sounds faded. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. The fire had burned out, and the clearing was pitch black. I crawled back into my tent, my heart pounding, and stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, Linda was the first to notice it. Near the edge of camp, a tree had been stripped of its bark in long, deep gouges. It looked fresh, and it definitely wasn't the work of an animal. Chris and I told Linda about the noises we'd heard, and she looked genuinely worried. We decided to pack up and leave a day early. As we loaded the car, I felt a sense of relief. But as we drove down the dirt path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing among the trees. When we finally reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. We didn't talk much on the drive back, and when we got home, we all went our separate ways. I never brought up that trip with Linda or Chris again, but sometimes, late at night, I think about those footsteps, that breathing. Whoever or whatever it was, it wanted us to know it was there.